Well, welcome to Spiritual Foundations for Life. This is day number 359. Now, when we sit down with someone to help them, they're not just two parties present. You know that? There's always three. We have a role, the other person has a role, and God has a role. So if we try to fulfill God's role in their life, we're really going to mess it up. Have you ever tried to be someone else's conscience? Didn't work, did it? Now remember that God has drawn this line, and on one side of the line is what man is responsible to do, and on the other side of the line is what God is responsible to do. But on our side of the line, there's what we are responsible to do, and there's also what the other person is responsible to do. And so we can call ourselves the helper and them the helpee if we want, or perhaps we're the counselor, they're the counselee, maybe we're the discipler, they're the disciple, or maybe we're the encourager and they're just the inquirer. Now, the secular world has actually developed a whole science for this, and they come up with a lot of guidelines. They tell us things like, well, don't be an enabler. Don't be a rescuer. Don't be codependent with the other person. Keep your boundaries, all these things. But see, and these are all great things. We need to understand them. But there's one problem with secular science. They don't realize that there's actually three persons in the room and not just two. In every counseling meeting, there's actually like a triangle, and God is at the top of that triangle. We are the encourager. The other person is the inquirer, but God is also present in the meeting. And every side of that triangle represents a relationship, right? There's me, I have a relationship with the other person and God. The other person has a relationship with me and hopefully God. And then God has a relationship with me and the other person. It's got to be that way. Now, the most important part of the triangle for me is my corner where I personally am in relationship with God. However, if I want to help that other person, I need to learn to rightly relate to them as well as I relate to God. I need to develop certain skills such as trust and communication and forgiveness and acceptance and being a good listener and all these things. But as Christians, what should we actually be trying to accomplish in those meetings? We should be trying to help the inquirer in their relationship with God so that the triangle is complete. Remember that the person is a mess because of the fall, and God really has no plan B. God's only solution is to reestablish a fallen humanity and present them pure, spotless, undefiled back to God. That's his plan. So sadly, the world's method is really only a straight line between the encourager and the inquirer. And there's no way the person is ever going to be fully restored unless we bring God into the picture so we complete that triangle and help that person establish a relationship with God. Now, how can we give the person a complete solution if we ignore the reality of the spiritual world? In order to present the person with a complete solution, we have to include the reality of the spiritual world and then help the person understand then who is responsible for what. So we need to understand our part, and we need the person to understand their part, and we need the person to understand God's part. For example, if we have to try to make a person feel guilty for us, or I'm sorry, I'll say it this way. We do not have to try to make a person feel guilty for a sin in their life. Why not? Because it's God that's the convictor. That's his part. Instead, we just point out the truth, which is our part, and then we let God do the convicting because that's God's part. Now, when people hear about the reality of the spiritual world and the existence of demons, even though we can encourage them that God is with them, you know what often they'll say, but there's demons here too? Well, that's one of the reasons why worship is so important. Because when we worship, we give God's divine attributes, we make them constantly before us. That's what worship is all about, declaring God's divine attributes. We keep our focus on that. So then it doesn't matter if there's demons in the room or not. See, that's the intention of worship, not to stroke God's ego, but to keep the attributes of God constantly in our minds. And then when we face the spiritual conflict, it is immediately minimized. We can, yeah, sure, we may sense a demonic presence, but right away we recognize that God is there also, because there's no place God can go where, or no place we can go where God is not, and He is always victor. He is always the more powerful one. So we can trust that God will always be faithful to His word and true and will never change. And that's what will give us the stability in life as we face these spiritual attacks. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. But for right now, our key point is that in every counseling meeting, there's actually a triangle, and God is at the top of the triangle. We must help the inquirer connect with God so that the triangle is complete. Our key verse, James chapter 1, verse 5, if any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him. God bless you. See you tomorrow for another episode of Spiritual Foundations for Life.